So now that we've had a deep dive on 1775 in Connecticut, we're now going to turn to another part of 1775-ish, that period. And this is going to be a story of an African-American soldier who served. This is going to be a tremendous story that's going to have a fabulous ending. And this is with John Mills, founder and president of the Alex Brienne Corporation, which researches and presents the lesser-known stories representing the life experience of the American enslaved presented from an African-American perspective. Added to that are stories of the Connecticut 29th and 30th Black regiments that served in the American Civil War. Added to that are other unknown stories of African Americans in Connecticut who have done tremendous work and lived their lives, whether they were bound or free, in what they did. And these are the kind of stories that we all need to know so that we understand those who came before us and what they did from every perspective absolutely possible. What I like about John Mills is that he goes to the person's story. It's not the story of everything going on around it, but it's really who the person was, where they came from, how they got to where they are. And the fun part is the descendants he finds of those people, to insert their story into the descendants' lives today, and to insert the stories of these people and what they have done in our cities and towns. So if you haven't heard from John, you're going to now, and you're probably going to invite him to come to your town and to do some research on some people as well. So, John, without further ado, it's up to you.
All right, thank you so much for having me today. I do appreciate it. As Terry said, I have a nonprofit here in Connecticut. It's called the Alex Brienne Corporation, intended to find, research the formerly enslaved, do as much digging into their stories as I can, chase forward in time to see if I can find current day descendants, if you come back to that information, and then find ways to inject those people in the communities where they lived, worked, or died. I kind of backed into the revolution. I was truly researching the enslaved. And in researching the enslaved, I would then go forward in time and end up finding information on Civil War participants. And then on occasion, I would also find an alignment in those same families of a Revolutionary War individual. And that started happening more often than I expected. I didn't realize there were so many African Americans I didn't know that fought in the Revolution. So that just continually started happening. And so I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to tell a story. I tend to personalize these stories. I make them, aligning to, my life, and then try to also align them to those current day descendants as well. So I'm going to do that. As I walk through this, it's not going to be in any chronology. It truly is like how I came to this Revolutionary War soldier. So just to give some guidance on how this is going to flow. And as I always do when I'm talking, I start out with my own story, so I'm going to do that. I'm from San Diego, originally, born and raised, came up in the 70s. In the, it was turbulent time back then, especially in California. Groups were being organized, like the Panthers, the S organization. My father was deep into that. And I got a little older. I was in the late 80s, early 90s, and I came to the realization that I had a bias against myself, against my own skin color, and I didn't know how that happened, considering my father was so adamant about beauty and blackness. And I got fearful of the fact what happened to my daughter, so I started trying to find ways to stop that from happening to my daughter at the time, and eventually found genealogy, which helped me change my own mind's perspective on colorism, unconscious bias, and it is a tool that I've used ever since. My sister introduced me to genealogy. She was telling me about my great-grandparents, who I knew nothing about. My grandfather died in '87. I didn't know anything about him, and she showed me this death certificate of his mother, and, let me see if I can do this. Of his mother, who was buried at Hickory Grove Cemetery in East Texas, in Kilgore, Texas. And we decided to go out there and visit to see this gravesite in 2003. We got to Hickory Grove Cemetery and realized that she wasn't there. And eventually realized she was buried behind Hickory Grove Cemetery in the woods. And so we had to process this idea that my grandparents had to carry their parents past the whites-only cemetery into the woods, the same path we had walked. That's a picture from July 4th, 2003, of us standing in those woods behind that whites-only cemetery. My sister introduced me to another individual in my family. His name was William Cooper. He fought in the Civil War. He was from Baltimore. And he was in the Navy, and he served on a bunch of ships during his Civil War service. My grandfather, who I knew well, he died in 2008, was also a heavy Navy man and didn't know anything about his great-grandfather, who was also in the Navy in life. But so it was a treat for my sister to discover that our grandfather's great-grandfather was also in the Navy. But we went searching for him and determined and discovered he was buried at Laurel Cemetery, which was paved over in 1957. It was an all-black cemetery in Baltimore, and in the 1950s, 30,000 African Americans were buried there. It was paved over. And so that's us just kind of standing in that parking lot where my third great-grandfather, Civil War vet, is buried. A mile down the road is Loudon Park National Cemetery, which is likely where he should be, but is not. And it's an ongoing effort for us to get him a stone there at Loudon Park. The VA will give us the headstone, but the cemetery wants $7,000 for the plot. So, so that's an ongoing effort. These two things gave me a sense of reverence for my own ancestors, right? You'd think they'd be like sad stories. They weren't for me, though. I started to realize that these people had to endure and live through a time where value was presented to them around them. Even in death, they were segregated. They were being shown who was valuable and who was not, and they were not presented as valuable. And even through that, they survived, persisted, procreated, and I can sit here and talk to you today because they did that. And so I gained an incredible reverence for these people. And I realized that my schooling had taught me about Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Frederick Douglass, but I wasn't related to any of those people. I wasn't related to the one in the millions. I was related to the millions. I was related to the people that were hidden and forgotten and buried under parking lots and in woods. And I revered them. I want to hear their stories. Where are those stories? And that is the precursor to the work I do now, finding those stories, the ones that people don't talk about, the ones that people think are sad, so they think they're not of value. I see them as value because it's like someone telling you they ran a marathon. If you don't know the struggles it takes to train for a marathon, if you don't know about the 4 a.m. wake-up calls and the blisters on your feet and the dehydration and the months of training, you wouldn't have a clear appreciation for that person who told you they ran a marathon. But if you understood that, you might revere them. And I see this the same way. If you tell the hard stories, it gives people the ability to revere them for their strength. And so that's what I do. I started researching individuals in Connecticut. I was researching this guy in Wethersfield, who was at the Wethersfield prison in the late 1800s. And I discovered that he may have been buried at the prison cemetery. The prison was at the DMV, where the DMV currently exists in Wethersfield. That was Wethersfield Prison. And right next to it is Cove Park. Cove Park was where the prison cemetery was, the back of Cove Park. So I was trying to figure out if this guy I was researching is still buried there, right? I'm trying to look through records to figure that out. And while I'm doing this, this historian in the area says, John, he's probably not buried here. And I said, why? Why not? Well, back then, there was this law that prisoners in the cemetery were at the disposal of the state medical institution, so if they weren't, their body wasn't, if they didn't have family, they could have just been sent to Yale. So that guy didn't have much family. He probably was sent to Yale for dissection. And I was like, what? I never heard of that. And so I started looking that up, and he told me a name. He's like, there's this guy, his name was Nicholas Monroe, and he was in this regiment called the 29th Connecticut Colored Regiment, and I didn't know anything about the 29th. And so I was now deep into the 29th, right? First it was just enslaved people, and now I'm like, 29th, what's the 29th? And this guy was buried here. And so I'm looking through these newspaper records, and sure enough, just like he said, the guy was in the 29th, he actually ended up being in the 30th, Connecticut's 2nd Colored Regiment. And after the war, he lives in Hartford. He was originally from Maryland, and he came here to join the 29th. But he stays, and he goes to prison for theft. And while he's in prison, he dies, and they bury him in Cove Park. But at the time, there was a controversy going on within the prison. The prison was being investigated, and so they were interviewing people from the prison about poor behavior at the prison, at the warden. And a person on the stand, under oath, claims that one of the guards was ordered to dig up Nicholas Monroe's body a day after he was buried to send to Yale. And so that's in the newspaper of the time. It's just the same story that this historian told me, right? And so I'm like, wow, this is crazy, right? Like, my family has all these alignments that end in these wild places, and now I have this story of this guy, and kind of ends in a place where he's not really buried. We don't know where his body is. So I continued along that path, like, okay, let's find some other people. And I then stumbled across, forgive me, I'm like struggling a little bit with the display. There. I stumbled across an individual by the name of Isaac J. Hill, who was also in the Connecticut 29th Colored Regiment. He was from New Jersey. He came here specifically to fight in the 29th. And after the war, he goes back to New Jersey, and I go looking him up only to discover that he was buried in this cemetery that was also paved over in the early 1960s. And all the stones from that cemetery were moved to a cemetery down the road, and they were lined up against the fence. So all these black Americans that were buried there are still under this parking lot. And I started thinking, this can't be a coincidence, right? Like, I've gone down literally 4 lines, 2 of which were mine, and they all are ending in the same way. And this just happens to be a random guy that I'm researching from Connecticut, and he's under a parking lot, right? He was in the 29th. And so this was something that propelled me again toward more research into the 29th and these individuals. I wanted to know more about who they were, why they fought, who was Connecticut. You know, I knew a lot. I knew, you know, what I could interpret from what my sister had told me from my own family in Texas, but that's the South. Well, what about the North? Right, I wanted to know more, and so I started digging into the stories of the North, and I started, again, I'm still in this Civil War era. Like, I haven't gotten to the Revolutionary era. I'm still in the Civil War era, and I learned about the Militia Act of 1792, and I learned about how, although there were African Americans that served in the Revolution, how the Militia Act specifically aligned, like, the requirements for states in creating state militias, that these individuals must be able-bodied white males. Like as if it wasn't legal now to be black and part of a state militia. I learned about Connecticut developing out, I don't know if I'm going the right way. I learned about Connecticut in 1818 developing out their first state constitution. And in that state constitution, making it really clear that as a requirement to vote, you must be white. So African Americans in the state couldn't fight and they couldn't vote, leading up towards the Civil War. I learned about another element that I think impacted that whole time period in the African Americans of our society, and that is the Dred Scott versus Sandford case. And Dred Scott, an enslaved man in Missouri, his enslaved labor takes him to Illinois. Missouri is a slave state, Illinois is not. And the logistics of that, bringing him to a place to believe he should be able to be free. He should be able to file suit and be free. And so he filed a case that eventually went to the Supreme Court. And at the Supreme Court level, the case was thrown out because the ruling was, you're an enslaved man, you're black people are not citizens. And so since you're not citizens, you can't bring a case to the Supreme Court. Again, all of these things I think have alignment to those that participated in the Civil War, in that from a Connecticut perspective, you couldn't fight, you can't vote, and from a U.S. perspective, you're not a citizen, leading into the Civil War. I then discovered, the Civil War is well on, and there are some challenges as it relates to Lincoln's perspectives on getting the seceded states to give up the cause. And at that time, in 1862, the Militia Act of 1862 is passed, which changes that wording from the Militia Act of 1792 to allow for black people to fight. So it removes that requirement of white. But it also adds in a section that says, but if they fight in a state militia, you can pay them $10 minus $3 for their clothing, which would equate to $7, which was just over half what a white Civil War soldier was being paid. So you can fight, but we're going to pay you half, right? And that perspective I could see when I'm reading the narrative of an individual by the name of Isaac J. Hill. At the time, he wrote a book after serving in the Civil War. In his book, he talks about not only while serving, not being getting the bonus that he was promised, and the regiment not getting the bonus. He talks about the regiment refusing to acknowledge the flag because they didn't get that bonus. He talks about how they were treated when they went to Annapolis and the racism while they were serving. And he talks about a lot of stuff, but he also talks about after the Civil War was over, as the 29th was coming back to Connecticut, learning that the state of Connecticut put it up for vote. Should they remove this requirement to be white out of the state constitution, this requirement to be white to vote? And Connecticut in 1865, the citizens voted that down. So he talks in the book about, as the 29th is traveling back to Connecticut, learning that the state, although they fought for the state, was saying that they could not vote. And so you kind of, we're back to that context of value. I traveled to, I went to the state library kind of talking to an individual there that I talk to often about these stories, Kevin Johnson. And he's like, John, you're researching the 29th, why don't you go down and check out that memorial that they have down in New Haven? And I was like, you got a memorial in New Haven? He's like, yeah, it's at Chris Squallow Park, you should check that out. And so I said, all right, so I traveled down to New Haven and I saw the monument. I was still struggling with this thing. And I saw the monument. I was like, wow, this is wild, right? I'm checking this monument out. And I knew that there were 1,700 men that had enlisted, but the monument only had 1,000 people. And so then, I'm on this mission to try to figure out how to fix that, how to get these other 700 people on this monument. But I noticed also inscribed and ingrained into the stone right out the front of the monument were these two gentlemen. And I was really interested in who these people were. Who is that? The gentleman on the right was a man by the name of Daniel Stanley Lathrop. So I was able to figure that out. Yes, yes. You might be related to these people. This is good. So, because we got descent, it's always good. So it's Daniel Stanley Lathrop, and I decided, well, let's research Daniel Stanley Lathrop. Where is he at? You know, I keep running down these lines, and these people end up, you know, in these odd places. I started with the newspapers, and in the newspaper of the time, actually some years after the Civil War, I find Daniel Stanley Lathrop in the newspaper. And he's, at the time, long after the Civil War, right, he's serving in the Connecticut National Guard in a segregated unit. And he's upset. They were like, in this article, they were presenting a painting to one of the leaders of their unit, another African-American man who had served in the 54th Massachusetts. And so they're interviewing various people and in the paper, and they interviewed Daniel Stanley Lathrop, and he's upset basically because he's saying, we're still segregated, right? After the Civil War is long past, we're still segregated, and we can tell that Connecticut does not want us to even fight. They're trying to get rid of us. And I found incredibly interesting. So I continued to dive into him. I ended up ordering his pension documentation. And in his pension doc, he was very meticulous about telling his story. He talks about growing up in New Haven. And he talks about his father, his mother. He talks about how when he enlisted on November 18th, 1863, and Connecticut was going to send him, he was being sent to the Rhode Island 14th Heavy Artillery Regiment. But the very next day, after he had enlisted, thinking he was going to Rhode Island, on November 19th, Connecticut began and started the 29th Connecticut, so then he ended up being a part of the 29th. So he tells this story, right? He goes into this great detail about what he knew about his lineage. And I put some parts of it that he said in there. He says, talking about what he knew of his family, he says, talking about his father, he says, Job Lathrop, or his grandfather was Job Lathrop. Job Lathrop was named of my grandfather, my father's side. He lived at or near Canterbury. And he talks about where in Canterbury. So far as I am informed, there were 4 sons of Job, and he starts talking about the names of his aunts and uncles, of whom he's saying he doesn't know them. His father just told him those were the names of his uncles and aunts. And then he says, I have never heard of, seen, or known of any other children of my parents, through information of my parents, or any other person or persons whatsoever. So the reason this is important is he's basically saying, I know who my mother is, I know who my father is. My father told me the name of my grandfather, his name was Job, and my father told me the name of my aunts and uncles. They're all in Canterbury, even though we live in New Haven, and I know nobody else. That's all I know, which is an aligning story to many African Americans, right? I think that's a common story for African Americans to only know back to their grandparent or their great-grandparent. That's as far as it goes. So when I read that, I had an immediate alignment. I was like, wow, that's so common. So I started digging in, how far does this go back? His father's name was Luke. Also, I learned that Luke was also from Canterbury. And I was trying to figure out, how did Luke get to New Haven? I never really figured that out, but one of the descendants shared with me that there was this published paper from the 3rd Annual Convention of Free People of Color in Philadelphia in 1833, and it lists Luke being a participant there, and it lists him as being in New Haven. So I know at least by 1833, Luke had moved to New Haven from Canterbury, which was an interesting thing to me because I know that same year was, 1832 through 1834 is the whole incident with the Prudence Crandall School for Girls and how she allowed Sarah Harris to be a student. And white Americans pulled out their kids, and so then she turned it into a school for young black girls, and eventually the well is poisoned, and the citizens of the town try to burn it down, and she ends up having to close up shop. That's around that same time, so it made me wonder, there was that unrest in Canterbury, is that same time period, is that why Luke left? I still don't know the answer to that, but it made me wonder. Moving away from that, and we'll come back, I was researching an individual that I had read in a book by the name of Primus. I'd read this book, it's called Old Houses of Ancient Town of Norwich, and in the book it talks about a man named Primus who was enslaved to a man named Ebenezer Lathrop in Norwich. Later on, it talks about him being given a home that was a warehouse to live in by Ebenezer's nephew, Rufus Lathrop. And he lived in this warehouse, which was right across the street from Rufus, for the remainder of his life until he died. And that warehouse, that home, was right next to a school called East District School on Washington Street in Norwich. And the book talks briefly about how the school kids would leave the schoolhouse, and he would give them nuts and tell them stories of his transatlantic slave journey to America. And I talked briefly about how the kids would cry listening to old Primus tell his story. And it was a fascinating read. I wanted to know more about Primus. I found another book that talked a little more about Primus, but it was dedicated to his lineage. And it talked about Primus having a son named Job. And it said that Job had enlisted in the Revolutionary War on March of 1776. And he was under Captain Jedediah Waterman in Colonel John Durkee's regiment. And he was discharged 9 months after serving on January 1st, 1777. And it talked about how he came back to Norwich after his Revolutionary War service, and he was still enslaved to Ebenezer Lathrop, just like his father Primus was enslaved to Ebenezer Lathrop. And a citizen in Norwich wanted to provide Job his freedom. His name was Caleb Huntington. And so he paid a handsome amount of money to purchase Job from Ebenezer Lathrop. And then a month later, he freed him. And in the town records, he makes a statement as to why he's freeing him, basically saying no man should be put in a position of servitude like this. And so I found that fascinating. Now I had pieces of a transatlantic slave journey and this Revolutionary War service. I then learned that Job then purchased the freedom of his wife using his Revolutionary War wages. His wife's name was Sylvia. And they moved to Canterbury. They also had a 1-year-old son. I'll call him Job II so that we have some distinction. So Job II was 1, and they were unable to purchase his freedom. He's not freed for another 28 years. 28 years later, he's freed in Canterbury, and he has a son, and the son's name was Luke. And that son left Canterbury and moved to New Haven, which brings us back to where we were. Luke's son was Daniel Stanley Lathrop, that individual that was on that monument at Criswallow Park in New Haven. And that was fascinating to me. Like, I had this one family that had all these alignments, like they had a transatlantic slave kind of story, pieces of it. They had enslavement and purchasing one's freedom. They had Revolutionary War service, and now through Daniel Stanley Lathrop, they had Civil War service. And so I wanted to learn more, if I could, about Primus and this enslavement and this transatlantic journey. I was struggling to find anything until I was talking to the city historian in Norwich, and he's Dale Plummer, and he's telling me, you know, this woman, Lydia Sigourney, who's a famous writer and poet of the time, wrote about Primus in a book, but he couldn't remember what the name of the book was. So I started, you know, I go home after he tells me this, and I'm like digging and digging, and I find the book. It's a book called Sketches of Connecticut, 40 Years Since. It was published in 1824. And in the book, in chapter 6 of that book, is entirely dedicated to Primus. All 14 pages. And it's written as if she's just talking to him. Like she's taking dictation, and he's talking, she's writing. Which was shocking to me. I wasn't sure if that really was how it occurred, or is that just how she intended to write it. But the details were incredible. This is just a portion of what she wrote in these 14 pages. It's written as if he's speaking, right? And this is Primus, speaking of his mother. He says, "Hide yourself, my son," she hastily exclaimed. "These are the men who make slaves of us." But in a moment, their grasp was upon my shoulders. She shrieked in agony, "Take him not away. He is our only one. Spare him. He is my all. He is but a child. What service can he render you? Take me and leave him. For when this sickness departs, my hand is stronger than his. See, I am well already. I will labor for you and be your slave. But let him stay to comfort his father." She had finished speaking. They had torn me away. I gazed back on my dear home and saw that she had crept to the door, for she was unable to walk. There she lay groveling, following me with her eyes, and filling the air with incessant screams while she implored the gods of Africa to restore her child. It goes on. Primus talks in detail about getting to the slave ship, and while he's on the ship, he finds that his father is on the ship. And in the journey to America, there was an illness that came over the ship, and his father was one of the first to die. And by the time they arrived here in America, most of that cargo had died. He was one of the few that was still alive. And he talks in detail about this, and he talks about then being enslaved to Ebenezer Lathrop. He talks about his life. It goes into detail about his daughter. It was just an incredible read to me that read like a slave narrative. Like here in Connecticut, we hear about Venture Smith and James Mars, William Grimes. Like, we know those slave narratives, but this to me was like a hidden slave narrative. I wasn't sure if I could call it that though, right? Lydia Sigourney's writing this. Like, how do I know she got that directly from him, right? So I start digging into Lydia Sigourney and discover that Lydia Sigourney, as a child, she went to that school. Not only that, her family was considered family of the Lathrops, the people that Primus was enslaved to. She writes in this book that was published in 1867. She died in 1865, and they published one of her works two years later. She writes in that book, talking of her father, she says, "He became a member in his boyhood of the family of Dr. Daniel Lathrop, a man of distinguished talents and collegiate education, matured for foreign travel." She also says in the book, talking of the widow of Dr. Daniel Lathrop, she says, "Left childless and destitute of near male relative, the care of my father over her affairs had become indispensable, and he with his household were tenants of a part of her mansion." Basically, she's saying, I lived in the Lathrop home with my father. She later in the book talks about being born in this Lathrop home. She also says, talking of that schoolhouse that sat right next to Primus's house in Norwich, She says, talking about the schoolhouse, she said, "I had always attended at a schoolhouse, sheltered and shouldered by ledges of gray rock, and within sight of the windows of our dining room." The dining room being that home of Daniel Lathrop. And sure enough, you can go there today, that schoolhouse still stands. And when you look at it, you see the gray rocks, exactly what Lydia Sigourney was kind of depicting, right? And so it makes it much more plausible that, not only did she attend that school, but she was in the family that enslaved him, that she would have been talking to him, right? And then she also says that in her book, Letters of Life. She talks about speaking to Flora. She talks about speaking to his kids. And so I believe this is a slave narrative that the state of Connecticut, or the historians here in Connecticut, should probably align at the same level as a William Grimes or a James Mars or a Venture Smith. I encourage you to pick up that book and read chapter 6. So, this broad story of Daniel Stanley Lathrop, who fought in the Civil War, and him not knowing much about his ancestry back just to Joe, who was that one-year-old child, and only knowing the name, not knowing anything about his family's alignment to the Revolution, not knowing anything about Primus and that transatlantic slave journey, no sense of that history of his own family, to me resonated, right? It's very common from an African-American perspective to have that alignment, that type of understanding and lack of understanding of one's own family. It resonated with me. So I just started telling this story, and I don't know that I found them. I think the descendants of Daniel Stanley and Primus probably found me. But I eventually was able to talk to them, and I thought it might be interesting for us today, as we talk about the 250, to talk to current day descendants of a man who fought in the Revolution, and people who fought in the Civil War, a family that has a transatlantic slave journey alignment, and all of which happened right here in Connecticut. So you got to get their perspectives on the 250th and how we should be including the African American diaspora in those talks. So if you don't mind, I'd like to welcome up to kind of have a conversation with me the great-grandson of Daniel Stanley Lathrop, Michael Lathrop, and the second great-granddaughter of Daniel Stanley Lathrop, Dawn Lathrop-Goode. I thought it would be a good thing for us to kind of just talk about when you learned about your alignment, your Connecticut alignment to Daniel Stanley Lathrop.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I first learned about it right around the time the monument to Daniel was created, or to the Connecticut Colored Regiment was created in Criscolo Park. That's when I first learned that I had a Civil War veteran in my family.
Okay. It did at the time. Was that as much as you knew?
That was it. That was as much as I knew at that point.
And Michael?
Yes, my name is Michael Lathrop, and before I go on, I just want to publicly thank you, John, for all the work that you do. I'm very humbled by this whole experience, and I'll be forever indebted to you for the information you brought forward and connecting the dots from my family. I first learned of Daniel Stanley Lathrop probably as a teenager in the 70s. A little hint to how old I am, right? I didn't know the significance of it at the time. There was a picture that was in my household and probably came from my grandmother of him. It wasn't this photo, it was a close-up. And so I saw this man in a uniform, but didn't know what war he fought in, or even who it was, really at that time. Until fast forward to the early 2000s when this group was formed to commemorate the 29th Infantry, did I really learn his role in it, and that was it, really. So that is when I first learned about it in any depth.
So I'm interested now also then, okay, so beyond Daniel, when did you get, like, each of you get deeper into this broad story and start learning about, Job and his Revolutionary War service and Primus and this enslavement and the narrative around that?
I think I started, on Ancestry.com probably about 2011, 2012 or so. Got the leaves popping up, so I started digging more and more and more. I still didn't realize that I had ancestor that fought in the Revolutionary War at that time.
Right.
I pretty much just got back as far as the Civil War, maybe back a little further, and just kind of stopped at that point. Yeah.
And Michael?
I came to know of it a little bit later than Dawn. And I told you this story the other day. I'll try to make it as brief as possible. But I was living in Maryland at the time, and a woman knocked at my door one Saturday morning, and she was campaigning for someone in a local office there. And she had this excitement, I could just tell, And she said, I was, hoping that you would be home, and I'm so glad to meet you, because my husband is related to the Lathrops. And she said, she asked me, she said, do you know about your family's history? And you got to know that I didn't know much beyond my grandfather. I really didn't know. I don't know if my father knew, because Daniel Stanley Lathrop died 2 years after my father was born, so he clearly didn't know him. And so after 20 minutes of talking to this woman, we felt like we were cousins at that time. She said, my husband dabbles in genealogy. Do you mind if he takes your information and traces your genealogy? I said, sure. Okay, what I had to lose. Well, a few weeks later, I get an envelope in the mail about an inch thick that he had traced and printed all this information, much of which you presented here today. So that's when I came to know of it, and that was 2018.
Right.
So it changed my whole perspective. I was, quickly filled with immense pride, and I got to tell you, since that day, I walk differently.
Right.
Before I did not know of my, ancestry. We knew of a prominent family that lived in Norwich, but I didn't feel any connection to it. I couldn't imagine that I had some direct, correlation to that family. And my father didn't know. He was contacted when the monument was erected in 2008 by someone who lived in Norwich. He might have been the mayor of Norwich at the time, by the last name of Lathrop, and because he had read about my father in the paper. And that was the first real connection that we had to anybody in Norwich. So yeah, it just changed my whole perspective on, my sense of purpose and where I came from. Because up until that point, we really didn't know.
And I take it, like, I get from you that, and I think I've heard this from Dawn, that there's just a level of pride in kind of knowing these components relative to your genealogy and history. I'm also interested in, I know that lots of states and the museum space and historical societies in various states are trying to determine how do they tell this story, how do they celebrate the 250th as it relates to marginalized communities. Like, how do they bring them in? I've heard these questions, right? And so I thought it would be interesting to ask you a similar question, like, knowing that you guys have this tie, we have a known tie to all of these elements, right? Specifically the revolution. How do you feel about, like, you know, the 250th and your alignment to that? Uh-oh, you smile.
Honestly speaking, it's a little complicated. While I'm proud, you know, that I have ancestors that fought for this country and helped to form this country in 2 wars, the means by which they got to this country, I can't really be too proud about. The way they were necessarily treated by this country, I can't really be too proud about. You know, the fact that Daniel didn't even know anything about his grandfather or great-grandfather, you know, it's like 1-2 generations back. The fact that Mike and I didn't know anything about our family in 2020, you know, 2020, 2018, 2017, it's so to celebrate the 250th, there's not really much of an attachment there for me emotionally, because while, you know, the U.S. was fighting for freedom from Great Britain, my ancestor fought and was still enslaved after the fact. So it's complicated, you know. Had Primus not been taken, I wouldn't be here. But he was still a 10-year-old boy that was kidnapped. So it's mixed feelings. It's complicated. So how you would make that relevant to other people of marginalized groups,
No, I hear you.
Only thing you can do is tell the truth. You know, people don't want to tell the truth, and I think the only way you can do is be honest with yourselves and be honest with us about history. If you are a historical society, you have to be honest about history, and then all of history.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's probably a common alignment. I know me and Michael, and I heard you say earlier about, like, you remember 1976. And I've spoken before about that. I was young, but I remember, what I remember most is those 1976 coins, and I don't remember any of my family feeling an alignment to it either. And today I don't tend to have those around me that feel an alignment to it. And so, yeah, I would imagine it would be tough for historical societies and museums to try to figure out how to be inclusive there in a way that would bring in the African American community. Because I think your perspective, Dawn, probably is common with a lot of people. Your perspective, Michael?
Yeah, my sentiments would be sort of the same as Dawn, you know, having been 14 at the time of the 200 celebration. I didn't feel a connection then. And you know, I do see more of a connection now, knowing that, you know, I had an ancestor who fought in the Revolutionary War, but, you know, under the circumstances in which he fought, you know, is troubling to me, because I got to think that he was, you know, forced to serve versus volunteered to serve. And at that point in time, when, you know, much of the black community was still enslaved, I'm a bit ambivalent about, you know, my feelings about that as well. So, as Dawn, my advice would be just to tell the story and tell the whole story, you know, as it relates to the black involvement in that, because we do know many chose to fight for the British and were given freedom and, you know, sent to Nova Scotia. So. Did Joe make the right choice? You know, it's you know, I am very grateful that they served honorably, and I'm grateful to have the freedoms I have in this country while I still have them.
I think considering the current environment and the current administration, and I think that the alignment for the black community might even be a little more difficult. And so I would encourage the same thing for historical societies and museums to, as I grew in reverence with regards to hearing my own family's stories, to work really hard to make sure that the research that you're producing and providing is just as accurate as possible. And with that, I know I only got 5 minutes. I'll close and open it up for any questions. Oh, let me put on my glasses. Yes,
I was just doing some online research while also paying attention to what you were saying, and I looked up in the 2020 election. Trump was against the Project 1619, saying that that was all, a lie, distortion, and everything. And right now, Musk has convinced him to attack the black government in South Africa because he doesn't like the fact that they are fighting or using affirmative action. Then we have down, I don't know if you know, that the Department of Defense, I believe it was, with the wonderful Hegseth, who is the new secretary over there, they took paint and put paint all over the diversity and equity walls, anything that says this. So, you have the distorter and divider in the White House, whom I would compare to George III. And then you have his General Gage, Elon Musk, going into every department and wreaking havoc. And I don't know, somehow we have got to organize and stop these people. I think that really we are in a situation that is one of the worst our country has ever been in. And, these people who have denied truth, and you have DeSantis down there in sunny Florida trying to tell people in the textbooks that slavery was good for the people because it taught them skills. So I think that we need to do something, to organize and fight these kind of lies. Thank you.
Yes, Terry.
Yeah, New Haven.
Yes, I'm in New Haven.
Yeah, fortunately, I didn't have to travel anywhere too far. Yeah, so that was absolutely a good thing.
I live right up the street from the park where that monument is. Last September, there were a group of Yale students there on a tour, and I had to stop. And I told them who I was relative to the image that was etched there. They were just so amazed. So it's with great pride that I get to go by it at least once a day.
Yes.
Thank you all for sharing today. I think the story is so amazing and so moving and resonates for people of color. I don't know my ancestry on my dad's side because it gets erased. My question is, as people try to research and tell these stories, what advice do you have? Because it's very difficult. A lot of the times there's no last names or the last names changed. There's not much mention. What advice do you give to groups that are individuals trying to find these stories in their own towns?
Yeah, I commonly refer people. I mean, we're fortunate here at the Connecticut State Library that they have genealogists on staff that can just help you for free. So I commonly refer people, if you're from here in Connecticut, to go to your state library, go to the state library, whether in Connecticut or not, go to your state library. I would say start there. I mean, because there's pieces to this work that are tedious and complicated. You have to kind of learn tactics and mechanisms to kind of get to the detail. It's a skill you have to learn, right? And so that's where I tend to tell people to start, your state library.
Are you able to go back to the tribes in Africa that sold you into slavery? Or find it?
I haven't done enough detail to determine whether or not we could even get there. But so that would be great if we were able to figure that out. He's very clear about where he lived, what was around where he lived. He gets into lots of detail. So I would assume we could get further based on the detail he provided, but we haven't done that yet.
There's actually like an Ancestry me, I think it's called African Ancestry, a DNA test where they're able to, based on that, follow your maternal line. So this is my paternal line, but based on your maternal line, they're able to get around the general area of what tribe you were related to or come from.
Yes.
Thanks for the presentation, really informative. I was wondering if you present a little more information about the Connecticut soldier and the Connecticut line. Like, did you research any of the service information? You have details of where he served? And do you have any other sense of the amount of men from Norwich that served as well, at least in '75? Just curious.
Yeah, a couple things. Well, I was able to pull up his wife who passed, and she talks within his pension document. She applied for his pension, and within that documentation, it talks a lot about where he served, who he served under, and the details of his return. With regards to other soldiers from Norwich, the Norwich Historical Society is here, and they're actually helping me with that now. We're doing work in Norwich to acknowledge the burial site of other Revolutionary War soldiers that were buried in Old Norrichtown Cemetery. If you ever visit that cemetery, right on the gate to enter that cemetery is a plaque that talks about every Revolutionary War soldier that's buried there, but only those that are white. And there's a black section, and we know of the names of other Revolutionary War soldiers that were black. And so we're currently in a project that my nonprofit is funding to put a marker in that section which will also list these black soldiers in that cemetery. As well as we're in collaboration with UCFS Healthcare, who owns a building right behind that black section of the cemetery, which is like barren. There's really like 1 or 2 stones there. But they own a building, and we're painting a mural on that building in celebration of the service of African Americans, but very specifically this family. So that's an effort, a $14,000 effort that's ongoing. But yeah, with regard to the soldiers, Janine is here from the Norwich Historical Society. She should probably get you those specific names that we're going to be adding to that panel.
Could you join me in thanking John for an excellent presentation? And this is why a number of us really love to work with John, because you see the way that he developed this presentation with these pieces, right? And it's like a puzzle that he's putting together, and it all comes together in a really, really fascinating way. But I also, before you guys leave the stage, I also want to address something that you said, and that was a question of celebration of the 250, right? And when we were working on the Civil War commemoration, we talked about this a lot, this question of celebration versus commemoration. And I think that there are differences between the two things, right? Commemoration is, I think, exactly what we did today. And that is a rethinking and a reconsideration and a thoughtful look at what this history means and how it has changed since the time it occurred to how we're looking at it today. So there might be elements of celebration that exist within this, but it's not just all about, cakes and I don't know, fireworks, right? It's about the incredible tapestry of a story that this nation has, that so many of us are devoted to trying to understand better. That's the real element of this that matters so much. And that's why it's so important for all of us to be working together and figuring out ways that we can get these stories out and determine how does this make us understand our past in a fuller and better way. I think that's really the key. So thank you all so much for your participation. Thank you. So, thank you.